groups, whatever, will join in. So what we were doing, and I'm going to continue, I didn't finish that unit yet, is we're talking about the Jews of Germany. Remember, we already learned that the Jews have been expelled already 1290 from England. They've been expelled 1394 from France. So many of them have now found their way eastward into Germany. Again, there is a Holy Roman Emperor who, so to speak, rules over all of Germany. That would include some other areas that we would think of as even parts of Czechoslovakia or Austria, but primarily Germany. But he's not a very strong central authority, and the whole country is broken up into like different dukedoms and principalities. So the Jews, even if times were very difficult in a particular locale, and they would be expelled from there, so they would just go to another town or nearby region and stay there until perhaps conditions improved and they could return once again to their original thing. But constant movement, great upheaval in their lives. And as I said, I remember mentioning to you last time, I can't imagine, especially as a woman, you'd be responsible, for your household and your children, and just constantly picking up and moving and adjusting to a new house, whatever. Conditions were just horrendous, besides the usual plagues and diseases, et cetera, which of course, affected anybody who lived, in those particular countries. So just going to backtrack ever so slightly. So the key Rav, we think of an Ashkenazi Jewry. His name is the Maharil. His name Rabbi Yaakov Halevi Amolin. This we're talking about going into the early 15th century. And he lived in mines and wars. I'm not going to repeat everything, but I just wanted you to know that. He also lived for a time in Austria. I remember I told you Vienna becomes a great center of Jewish scholarship during this time period. But again, not that things were so fabulous there, and they too, suffer their usual spate of attacks, or expulsions from their particular territories. I talked to you then about the Hussite War that was from 1420 to 1436. It was actually this huge dispute between the Roman Catholic Church and the followers of John Huss, who was killed early on in this campaign, and he's considered to be a precursor to the Protestant Reformation, but that won't take place till the 16th century. And in case, obviously, Hussites lost the end, were brutally murdered, right? And the Catholic Church remained supreme until the next century. And I talked to some other individuals. I don't have to talk about every single one of them, but just so you know that there were some key personalities. I have here, I know it's hard to share a map. This is actually, this comes from one of Martin Gilbert's works. He has all these map books that you can get. He's no longer living. He's a British scholar. This one's, the title of it's The Jews of Central Europe from 1000 to 1500. And it just shows you all the migrations, that took place, during this era. Okay. I think the last person I was discussing with you was Rav Yisrael Isserlein, who wrote a book called Trumat Hadeshen, which is a halachic work. There were a few, just to kind of recount. So the great period of the Tosfos, that's into the 12th and the 13th centuries. By the end of the 13th century, all the great scholars that we consider to be Baalei Tosfos, have passed on. So what they did in the succeeding centuries is that they would have gone over, organized, refined perhaps, some of the phraseology. And, until it comes into the form that we know it today, which surrounds the actual texts of the Mishnah and the Gemara itself in a printed version of the Gemara. Now there are on occasion some of these latter Rabbanim who you will find mentioned actually in the Tosfos, because obviously over the next, let's say, 2 centuries or so, some of their works were also entered, into. By the way, I told you obviously the printing press again is not invented until the 16th century. Most, I often talk about scrolls, but they were really what we would call a codex. Like if you go to like a British museum, you can see these things. They actually are in book form. You so to speak turn the pages. They're on parchment, I believe, and they were obviously, but they're all hand written. But obviously, you could see, as opposed to a scroll that you have to, like the Torah scroll, right? We have to keep on, winding or rewinding to find your spot, that you want to study. With the codex, it was easier to turn the pages. All right, and then ultimately, obviously, the printing press was invented. Okay, the next person who I want to bring down, just because I think their lives are so interesting. First of all, just to show the continuity, it wasn't a total vacuum. It just obviously wasn't the richness of learning and scholarship during these centuries. But there has to be some sort of a linkage between, let's say, the great scholars, from that 12th and 13th century until we get more into the 16th, 17th centuries. So it is these, we have to thank these Rabbanim, for helping to make that great link. The last one I mentioned was the author of the Trumat Hadeshen. His name was Rabbi Yisrael Israelan. The next person, a contemporary of his, was a Rabbi Yisrael Bruna. He lived from 1400 to 1480. He actually had studied under Rabbi Yisrael Israelan. He served as a Rav in Bruna. All right, that's why it's called Rabbi Yisrael Bruna. The fact, like we have our last names, I mean, that didn't become more prevalent until the 17th, 18th century, when they were actually forced to have a last name. So it seems like it was very popular during these several centuries to name yourself after the town. We saw that in Provence, that a lot of them, they were known by the town from where they came from. Okay, so Bruna is in Moravia, Bohemia, Moravia. All right, we think of that as a Czech Republic today. And he lived there up until the year 1451, and they managed to be expelled from there as well. And then he went and he settled in Regensburg, okay, which is already had been an established Jewish town. Just a little anecdote. It says apparently there was a Rav there, head of a yeshiva. His name was Rabbi Anshel, and he obviously wasn't so pleased that this great scholar was coming into his town and might usurp his position. He thought he was encroaching, on his territory. Around this time period, the Holy Roman Emperor's name is Frederick III. He actually imprisons Rabbi Yisrael. Why does he accuse him? Because he refused to issue a ban of excommunication against his fellow Jews who wouldn't hand over a third of their wealth to the royal treasury. So thank God he was only in prison for a short time period, and then he was released. But then again in the year 1474, he was again in prison. This time it was like a ritual murder charge, that he had killed a Christian child, how they used the blood on our matzahs. But in any case, after he was actually sentenced to die, the true murderer, who ended up being a Christian, came to the fore. He confessed, and he was put to death. But meanwhile, the Rav was allowed to go free. He eventually left again Germany. Remember, he was in Regensburg, and he spent his remaining years back in Bohemia, in Prague, and there, his days ended peacefully. And he's also known, he has his own responsa. What happens is a lot of these works, I don't know if they were different scraps of, I don't know if they, the paper there, parchment, whatever. Then somebody at a certain point, sometimes these things didn't come out until a few hundred years after the deaths of these Rabbanim, but then they were compiled and then ultimately printed and spread out. So he wrote his responsa. It's considered a very authoritative halachic resource. And the Ramah, remember I told you before that the Ramah, when he comes and he, after Rabbi Yosef Karo comes out with this compilation of of standard halacha for Jews everywhere, but there was more of a Sephardic version. Right? So then the Ramah, Rabbi Moshe Isserles, who we will learn about at a later time, he wrote like the Ashkenazi version. So those of us who are Ashkenazi Jews, we're following. You're going to study like a person who studies the real Shulchan Aruch. It's actually several volumes worth, not the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, the little one volume set. But in there will be, it's a Rabbi Yosef Karo will tell you, would be the Sephardic way of doing a particular halacha, and then Rabbi Moshe Isserles, on the side has his the Ashkenazi way. So, and this is the standard down to this very day. Okay, there's another rabbi I want to mention to you. His name is Rabbi Moshe Mintz. There used to be a man who lived in our community whose name was actually Moshe Mintz. He unfortunately passed away this past year. I would have, too bad I didn't study this earlier. I would have loved to have asked him if he at all, was related to this individual. He lived from 1415 to 1485. And again, he makes that direct link. I'll show you from those Jews of Germany, the Rabbanim of Germany, and the new growing Jewish community in Poland. He started off, he was a Rav in Mainz, Landau, Bamberg, and he used to correspond. Again, that's what a Shelot and Teshuvot. They're not always just questions, a Shaila, Stam, Shimon or Reuven has a question and sends it. These were often scholarly exchanges between different Rabbanim from different communities. I have this difficulty here. How did you handle it where you live? And that's often what the Shelot were. So he at that point already, he was in correspondence with other halachic greats living in Germany, also Italy. We're going to do the Jews of Italy in a little bit. And including that Rabbi Israeline, who I told you, who was considered a great authoritative halachic scholar. There were persecutions in Mainz in the year 1462, so he had a lead. There was apparently this horrible pogrom that took place there, and all those manuscripts that he had saved over the years, all his correspondences, they were all destroyed. As we've already mentioned, conditions are deteriorating throughout Germany. It's no longer considered to be a safe and secure place for Jews to live. So he will ultimately make his way all the way to Posen in Poland. So I looked it up. I don't know exactly where Posen was. Sort of like in the center of the country. It's a region called Silesia. And so that's why now you can see that link, okay? Believe you me, there have been Jews already migrating and settling in Poland. But here's the first time we're going to hear about a Rav of stature who's actually going to go and become the Rav then in Poland itself. He taught many disciples there. He was a very strong influence, on standardization of halacha in that community. And again, he is considered to be the first of what will ultimately be many, many great Torah personalities, who will come from Poland and then ultimately Lithuania. And he's considered to be the first to actually officiate in the role as Rav of a particular community. So they say that, as I already told you, so many of his manuscripts were totally destroyed during that pogrom, but he continued writing responsa. Obviously had a prodigious memory, so he could remember what the Shelot were, and then he could write his Teshuvot, his answers. And they're actually published now. It's called Shelot Teshuvot Maharam Mitz. So he's a Maharam, which means, Moreno Harav Moshe. Okay. There's one more Rav. Just going to mention him a little bit. I'll talk to you about him more when we cover the Jews of Italy, and his name is Rabbi Yaakov Landau. And he lived from the years 1410 to 1487. He was a native German Jew. But again, because conditions are so bad, though, he actually moved to Italy. But I want to tell you more about him and the famous work that he wrote. All right. And again, he was also somebody whose works the Rama studied at a later date before he wrote his authoritative work on halacha. Okay. So look, we know the rest of the 14th century and throughout that 15th century, German Jewry are no longer going to be at their pinnacle anymore. They are certainly going to continue through the generations. And at a later point, we're going to hear again of some very great leaders among German Jews. But the country is so fraught with so many problems, economic, political, religious, persecutions, that eventually the center will no longer be in Germany. It will move eastward. All right. Okay. And then especially those of us who come from Poland, Lithuania, so we know what a rich Jewish life that became. All right. Now, obviously, some Jews did remain. It's not like they all picked themselves up and left. There are Jews who are still staying there, eking out a living in whatever way they possibly came. Their choices for employment are becoming more and more limited. Like even before, remember, money lending was one of the few occupations open to them. But, even that, Christian bankers are going to become more and more dominant during this time period. So the Jews still continued some of their money lending activities. Sometimes it would be a case where I guess a particular regional ruler might be in desperate need of money. So then he might then at that point turn to a Jewish money lender. Maybe the Christian ones didn't trust them anymore. So of course, the problem always was if whoever, the nobility or even the emperor possibly, if they didn't want to repay their debts, well, they just expelled them from their area. So that's how they got rid of it. So it was such a terrible little dilemma for these Jews. Should they lend the money to these people? Of course, they're sort of coerced to do so, but hey, it was really a tremendous risk that they were taking. Meanwhile, they still continued making, this is how they earned a living. They would then make loans of just small sums to different people, in their locales who needed it, other workmen, maybe different artisans, some shopkeepers, it was on a much, much lower level than what they had been used to in prior generations. But they still had to pay these enormous taxes. So whatever they earned, like such a huge portion of it, would then have to go again to the local nobility, and then always a portion to the emperor as well. And so really they were living in terrible, terrible poverty, because you understand why so many of them did leave and move eastward, because conditions were better there and a greater opportunity for them to have more stability in their lives. So they actually had to cross, those who live more in the northern part of Germany, they cross the Elbe River, and that's how they go eastward. So first, of course, they're going to hit, before they hit Poland, they're going to hit, right, well, what we would have known as years ago as Czechoslovakia, right? Remember, they have moved somewhat southeast. Also, they're in there in Austria. From Austria, they'll go to Hungary. This is how they're going to spread throughout Eastern Europe. And they're going to reestablish themselves, form new communities there, and hope for better times. Well, for a while it was. Not so much in the end, right? Okay, unfortunately. Okay, so now let me just get all my papers put back together, organized fashion here. Okay, now I'm going to, before I continue to Italy, which is actually quite fascinating, I want to do a whole unit just on Kabbalah, because I wasn't sure exactly 100% how to fit it all in. So I just want to show you how that the study of Kabbalah, it took hold of their imagination. You have to understand they're living in terrible times and things are so precarious. So somehow Kabbalah led them into some other realm, and gave them a certain measure of self. Okay, but where did it come from? I mean, we don't hear about it in earlier generations, but why will we start hearing about it more and more? And now as time goes on. Okay. First of all, in general, what we learned about, the Jews, and I'm talking even including those Jews living in Spain, like but certainly the Ashkenazi Jews. What type of literature, so to speak, did they read? So certainly those who were of a higher enough level, could go to the yeshivas, so they would have been totally immersed in, religious, the study of Torah and then the Talmud and then the various commentaries on these things. And this is, how they would grow in their wisdom. But the bulk of the people were not of that higher level. So what appealed to them? I mean, again, we're talking about those who for sure, I think most Jews were literate. I mean, yes, we were supposed to daven, you're supposed to read the Torah. So I'm sure every Jew sees some sort of rudimentary knowledge. I'm not sure 100% what it was like for women in those days. Certainly whatever they learned would have been in their homes. I mean, we know about Rashi's daughters, how brilliant they were. But by and large, you would have been taught in your home, and your mother would have been, and would have gone down, through the generations but again, I think perhaps they must have learned basic Aleph base, because I mean, you're still, as I say, you're still supposed to daven. You still should be able to read the basic Torah. Maybe you don't understand it fully, but I think, you were supposed to be of that high enough level to read it. But what appealed to them were these midrashic works, because there were stories, it was something that they could relate to, and they didn't have to like sit there and analyze it and tear it apart. And, they just read it for whatever pleasure, it gave to them. And they would read certain mystical types of works. Okay. So what were these things? That's what I want to discuss with you. First of all, why was there this even yearning for that type of literature? They wanted to have a God that they felt was close to them, that they could relate to, and that was taking an interest in their individual life. Now, of course, we all learn that God does do these things, but I guess they felt, seemed to be this huge gap. So they needed some sort of like Hashem to come down from heaven, right, and have a closer relationship with them. And they started speaking to him in more human terms. Remember, the Rambam was opposed to that. He didn't like the fact that they did that. And, that God was there, on a daily basis. He was very intimate with them. They believed in angels and how they would relate to all the angels. And this was happening both in the Ashkenazi world and in the Sephardic world. Now, again, there were not any key books, so to speak, that they studied, to learn Kabbalah. It was sort of handled on an individual basis, or, as I said, perhaps within their home. This is, these stories, would have come down. Again, they felt this great warmth and connection with God through these mystical explanations of, again, how God relates to them. And obviously it's going to become more a dominant thing in certain parts of the world as the time goes on. So it first seemed to become organized as a discipline to study in the Jews of Provence in the 12th century. So interesting, because they also are the ones who adopted the study of philosophy and the poetry, but there was an element there, that were attracted to Kabbalah. And then later it will go to Spain, and ultimately it will go to Germany even. Okay. We had touched on this a little bit earlier when I did the Jews of Germany at an earlier century. They called these secrets that they were learning, they call sod, all right, which means secret. Of course, eventually, it becomes more public knowledge as they're going to speak about it more openly and outwardly. Again, they wanted this very close spiritual connection, with God. They wanted to understand the Torah sort of like on a very high spiritual level, and also the Hebrew letters. All right, each letter and its formation, that there were like secrets of creation within the letters themselves. I can't understand it. Okay, it's not me. I come from a Misnagdish family that frowns upon all this stuff. So I did learn a little bit about it when I was in school, but I can't really relate to it. But I'm telling you, part of what their belief was. Now, they also had all these amulets. They had all kinds of incantations that they would recite. This was all part and parcel, of I guess, of having this, what they visualized as this close relationship with God himself. And that these would all lead them to like higher spiritual levels, and there were various people who would promulgate this. They were called the mystics, right? And at the beginning of the 11th century, it starts being written down now. Okay, so the first work to come out, actual work about Kabbalah, is called Sefer Yetzirah, which means the book of creation. Again, it's the 11th, not till the 11th century. And it was known even in the Gaonic time, towards the end of the Gaonic time period. And the Spanish scholars wrote works on it. And perhaps you have learned some of these different Kabbalistic themes. This 10 Sefirot, you have to go through different Sefirot till you reach the highest level, getting closest to God. Then the belief, other religions have this belief too, that air, water, earth, and fire, they're the primal elements of creation. And again, that the actual formation of the letters in the Hebrew language, they all have these mystical meanings, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so this was the basic text, all right? Came out again, I told you, in the 11th century, and it will be considered the key Kabbalistic work until the 13th century, until something else comes into prominence. Okay, so again, I told you a lot of it starts in Provence, right? Throughout the 12th century. Even that the Ravid, remember we had learned about him, who was from Poitiers, and he used to criticize the Rambam. He didn't like that, the emphasis on philosophy, and he felt it was a potential danger that people would leave the Jewish fold. And he was considered to be a Kabbalist, and his son also. And so gradually there became a more widespread study of the Kabbalah, and perhaps using this work in particular throughout Provence and Spain. And this continues into the 13th century. And then remember, I mentioned when we learned about the Ramban, right, Nachmanides, he definitely uses Kabbalah even in his commentary on the Torah. So it was a great influence. You can see it's making inroads in the Jewish community in this time period. He called these Kabbalistic ideas derech sod or derech emes, whatever. So it was sort of like a counterpoint, like the Rambam, you talk about rationalism, right? Philosophy, so this is not the opposite of it. This is, stress on mysticism, on spiritual things, as opposed to some more. Again, I guess for many people, this was the philosophy, I guess, was too difficult for them to even understand. So I thought maybe, it even turned them off. So studying the Kabbalah just had great appeal for them. And so it's going to sort of they're going to make this effort to actually supplant the emphasis on philosophy, even Jewish philosophy. It's going to make inroads and become greater prominence among certain Jews of that time period. And actually, there's like battle supreme broke out. Forget later on with the Misnagdim and the Hasidim, but already then they're talking about that 13th, that 14th century. There was this big battle between the Kabbalists and what we call the rationalists. Okay, Now, this is really interesting. I know perhaps you have learned this, I don't know. At the beginning of the 14th century, a new book appears. Okay, where did it come from? So there's a man, Rabbi Moshe ben Shem Tov de Leon. Leon is sort of northwestern Spain, where he comes from. That's why he has that last name, from Leon. He lived about 1250 to 1305. He was a traveling scribe. And he would collect different manuscripts. And he earned his livelihood. They would copy these old manuscripts and then distribute them. Around the year 1300, he announced he found a new commentary on the Chumash, which he claimed was written by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Now, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is from the 2nd century in Israel, and he's the famous story that the Romans are running after him. This is after the Bar Kokhba rebellion, and then how all those other great rabbis were murdered by the Romans, and he escapes with his son to where Meron is today, right? And he hides in a cave there for 13 years, and when he came out, when things were finally safe, so they feel that he then wrote a commentary on the Chumash, all right? And, he felt that, that the angels themselves, well, I guess if you're living by yourself for 13 years in a cave, he has a son who's there with him, but, so I'm sure you had some visions. And he felt that the angels came and disclosed certain secretive things to him, and that this way they would explain like all these profound meanings, in the Torah to him. So then he wrote this book. Okay, and he discloses some of these secretive things that he had been told while he was in hiding. And it's actually written in Aramaic. It's a specific form of Aramaic as opposed to Babylonian Aramaic, like the Talmud's written in, the Gemara. It's considered to be Palestinian Aramaic. And apparently, it was known only to a few people until this Rabbi Moshe de Leon discovered it. Okay, I don't know where he discovered it or how it happened to fall just into his hands. And at the time, it was eventually called, or even Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai called it Zohar. Okay, I believe this Rabbi Moshe de Leon gave this commentary its name, and it's called it Zohar, which means brilliance, because it revealed the divine light that a typical reader of Chumash, let's say, would not on his own be able to discover. And this now becomes the basic book of Kabbalah. So first we have that Sefer Yetzirah, and now we're going to have the Zohar, and this is going to become the preeminent book. Now, not everybody accepted, the Zohar. For a long time period, people thought that he himself had written this book, this Rabbi Moshe de Leon, and it really is not a Shema. Actually, I remember learning it like that. That there was no way to authenticate whether Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai from the 2nd century had actually written this book or not. I mean, how comes it was not known, to the greater Jewish world? But scholars have since he himself published some of his own books of Kabbalah, and going through them, one's called HaNefesh HaChachma. Let's see, there was another one. They don't feel, he has different interpretations of Kabbalah in there. So they really don't think that he authored the Zohar itself. Again, whether I can tell you 100%, there's Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, whatever, that's tradition, that's who wrote the Zohar. He wrote this other book called Sefer Harimon. And, whatever, it is now considered the basic work. And it has since obviously been published, many times. And there you talk about the 10 Sefirot and Hashem's 13 attributes of mercy, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So anybody who studies Kabbalah, like that's the basic work. I guess Sefer Yetzirah is still around, but not studied to the same extent as the Zohar. And apparently, even some Rabbanim in the Gaonic period have commented or made allusions to Kabbalah also. Again, there's, There's like these well springs there of great religious, inspiration. And it's interesting. So it caught on initially with the Jews of Spain. They were the first ones who were exposed to it. But it eventually will travel to Germany. We already had learned about this. I'll tell you a little bit more as we go on. And there too, it had its adherents in Germany as well. And again, I think it was just this desire, living through very difficult time periods, that they wanted to have this closer connection to Hashem, not so much from heavy duty studying, of halachic works, but just this beautiful, to them, mystical connection, and this raised up their spirits. Okay. Eventually, there'll be more additional work starting with the 16th century, but this is the main work that was studied at those time periods. It's interesting. So certain customs grew out of the study of Kabbalah, and in some instances, when people were trying to determine what a halacha might be over a certain point of law, they actually followed the Kabbalistic interpretation, because it was just becoming very, very popular. Now it says after the Jews were expelled from Spain, they continued to study it, but again, it gave them like a certain measure of solace, I guess, to think that there was this other realm and that they could someday, through good deeds, attain, this very close relationship, with Hashem. And, I can understand, why it would have been so appealing to them. That's why they turned to it. Now, it's interesting. I'm telling you that there also were adherents to the study of Kabbalah in Germany. Okay? We don't usually think of that as being the place. I remember I had discussed with you, but we're going to talk about it again. So it reaches the German Rhineland, or initially in the 10th and 11th centuries, and was actually brought there by this Kalonymus family. They were originally from Italy, but they migrated. They also went to France, but they migrated to Germany as well. And I guess this is again before the publication, right, some of these works, but the ideas were floating around already. And even, I told you, even in that late Gaonic period, like Rabbi Chai Gaon, he's one of the very last of the great Gaonim. He also was an adherent of Kabbalah. And, so his influence was also felt even into Germany. Again, they stressed the secrets of nature, and they also had their amulets and their incantations and like a sort of a belief in the supernatural. When you think about Germany in this medieval period, this was very common among the Christian, people at that time period. So they were being surrounded by these people with all their, beliefs and things that you couldn't see, right? Even demons, certainly that angels would appear, so I guess that they were ripe to incorporate this. Again, we're only talking about a certain element, we're not talking about most of the Jews of Germany did not follow this, but there were certain key individuals to whom this appealed to very, very much. Now these are called, I remember doing this with you, they're called Hasidei Ashkenaz, the Hasidim of Ashkenaz. They were never of a huge number, but they became, very well known. They actually had an influence on the rest of Ashkenazic Jewry. Not everybody, followed everything that they said. And this starts becoming, a more prominent, starting at the end of the 12th and into the 13th century. Now, but as opposed to the Sephardic Jews, their interpretation that they became ascetics. Interesting. That they took it sort of like to an extreme. It's almost like maybe you had to withdraw from life somewhat, to have this closer relationship, with God. They had, again, they considered themselves sort of like an elite, again, because it was only a small group of they had some Rabbanim at their head, but, the followers, they try to live their lives according to a very, what they consider to be a very, very high standard, lived a very simple life, studying and praying, and that somehow through their work, that they would advance the work of Hashem on earth. That's what means, I think, if I remember correctly, about going through those 10 Sefirot. You keep on going up in level until you reach the highest level, where you're in like a total communion with God Himself. And from this, we actually come to the words Tikkun Olam. Actually, I think comes from this concept, of living this very spiritual life, an ascetic sort of life. Obviously, when we talk about Tikkun Olam nowadays, we're talking about doing good deeds, right, to our fellow man. But they also, that was part of their belief. Would one become so close to God? Obviously, you had to do, works of chesed, so it was all incorporated, as part of their belief. So I would say the basic difference is like the Spanish view of Kabbalah was sort of metaphysical or theoretical, reflective, not so much, perhaps so much in practice, but a certain mindset. But when we talk about, those, they are called Hasidei Ashkenaz. They believed you needed more of a physical manifestation to adopt a lifestyle devoted to Kabbalah. Again, that's why you would have your different amulets and different, incantations. I told you, though, they led a very ascetic life. They felt that was very, very important. So that in their mind, studying Kabbalah and studying Halacha were on an equal basis. Now, the majority of German Jews are not following this, but this was a strong element. Are you there? What did I do? Sorry.
I think we're all here.
Can you hear me?
Okay. We're all here.
Okay. All right, very good. So again, the key leader of these, what we call Hasid Ashkenaz, his name was Rabbi Yehuda HaChasid. He came from Regensburg. Remember, we've learned about that city before. And he called that they had to adhere to strict morality, that be very honest. You had to have good control over the desires of the flesh. They actually believed that demons existed, in their lifestyle, but that the main goal that we have, is, I guess this would incorporate that idea of Tikkun Olam. You have a special love for God and mankind. You always had to be searching for truth. They did believe in reincarnation, and also the fact that, one should be willing to become a martyr. That was like the highest form of demonstrating one's total faith and belief in God. He had a disciple. His name was Rabbi Elazar of Worms, and he lived from 1160 to 1238. So again, you can see what I'm talking about now is a little earlier period than what we have. But I showed you how some of those Rabbanim in that 15th century were also, I don't know, complete, but somewhat adherents of the study of Kabbalah. All right. Eventually, this trend, this belief in Kabbalah, will travel eastward into Poland, and it's going to become a very strong staple of Eastern European Jewish life, and that will be the Hasidim. Okay. All right. Now, do something a little different. Well, just going to begin it because I see we just have like 5 minutes. So then I wanted to go back. Well, what's happening to the Jews of Italy? They are existing there. So first of all, just in general terms, Jews began migrating to Italy, settling there already in the Hashmonayic era. Now, it's possible they were there even earlier, but the first time we actually hear, right? Well, look, we are the Hashmonayic. So we're the first time that we encounter their actual interactions with the Jews of Judea is there were 2 brothers. Shalom Sion and Malka had died. That was their mom. There were 2 sons, Hyrcanus and Aristobulus, and they each wanted to become the next king of Israel. So idiots they turn to Rome, which of course is the dominant power at this time, and they tell them to come in and interfere and choose who should be the next king. Naturally, who's Rome going to choose? They're going to choose the weaker of the two brothers. They don't want a strong leader. And this is when Pompey, in the year 63 BCE, comes in with his army to establish order in Judea. All goes downhill after that. All right, but that's the first concrete time that we can hear that there's actual interchange between Rome and Judea. Now it's going to continue on, certainly through that rabbinic, the Tanaic, the Mishnaic era. Well, first of all, Rome at that point they destroyed then the Beit HaMikdash. I mean, they're the rulers there. For instance, the procurators and different governors. The emperors are always constantly interfering in internal affairs. And we also know because of the Churban, so many Jews were taken captive and sold on the slave market back in Rome. So the Roman Jewish community is going to be growing throughout the Roman Empire. Now it's all going to come crashing down because ultimately the Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire, is going to fall. So what's going to happen to the remaining Jews living in Italy? It's not like, okay, well, we got rid of those, awful Romans, but now the Byzantine Empire will be ruling over them for several hundred years. All right. And they're even more extreme as far as being anti-religion, trying to quell, the Jews' sense of independence and adherence to their own religious lifestyle. So I'm going to take it, I think I'll pause here because I think it makes most sense and I can continue from what happened from the Byzantine era. Also, when we talk about the Middle Ages, we really talk about from the years 500 to 1500. And so I'm going to spend a little bit on what we call the Dark Ages. That's from 500 up into the year 1000. Then what happened from the year 1000 to, again, that year 1500. Then we go into the time period of the Reformation. All right, so for any of this, we learned world history. So, kind of trying to pull everything together and just to see everything in general terms. Okay, so again, I hope everybody's well. Stay safe. May that virus or its many manifestations just pick themselves up and drown themselves in the ocean or something.
May I ask you a question? A very quick
Yes.
one. I'm sorry I was so late. I assume this is not Madonna's Kabbalah that you're talking about.
Yeah, it's the same thing,
Oh, yeah?
it's the same. I find it so ironic that, it has this great appeal among some, non-Jewish people. I mean, what's it asking of you? It's sort of like a belief system. Right, it's not. That's there's nothing specifically halachic about it. You want to believe in these other. I don't know. I remember when I was first introduced. I don't know. I was in high school, I was on college level. This thing with the 10 Sefirot, I couldn't even understand it. I mean, it's just so far out of the realm of the way I was brought up Jewishly. So and as I say, and again, I grew up in a very misnagdish house, so. They certainly frowned upon any sort of practices, or beliefs. I have to tell you that the one Rebbe that, and this is from Isaiah, who he had respect for was actually Rabbi Schneerson of Lubavitch. He says he really knows how to learn. He didn't think that much about some of the other Rabbeim, but he had great respect. I think Shalom has the picture now. I remember I was once, I was already married, I think, and I was in my father's house, and he always had these things spread out all over the place. My mother couldn't stand it. And I came across this fabulous, like a 8x11 photograph of my Zeta with this other Rav. Now, I didn't know who the other Rav was. Didn't mean anything to him. So I said, my father, can I have it? I want to frame it. It's such a beautiful picture of Zeta. Okay. I had it hanging in my house. And I think Joel recognized who it was, but I didn't. I had it hanging in my house. And one day, Rabbi Vogel, who was a Chabad rabbi in Rochester, I don't know what the purpose, he'd come over to our home, and he's looking around, and he sees this picture. Why do you have a picture of the Alter Rebbe and you're hanging on the wall of your house? I said, what? I said, that's my Zeta. But I guess the Alter Rebbe, that was, the previous, Rebbe
Previous
before,
Lubavitcher.
right, had come to America. Must be the 1930s. And there's this beautiful picture. Then they're both very stately. They're wearing, well, my Zeta wore a thing called a Prince Albert coat.
Yeah.
I guess Prince Albert used to wear that sort of a coat. And but they both have. Well, I don't know if the Alter Rebbe had, but my Zeta has this top hat. He was always known for his
All
top hat.
dressed up.
Yeah. And they look so distinguished, and there's sort of like a garden bench behind him. I don't even know where the picture exactly was taken, but everybody's coming from a different perspective. I see my Zeta in the picture, but this Chabad Rav, he's the Rebbe.
That's so funny.
It was very, very funny.
Still have the picture?
I gave it to Sholem. It's hanging. If you want to go to London, you can see it hanging in his home.
Alibi.
Yeah, so whatever. All should be good. When we get closer to the expulsion of Spain and the Jews of Portugal, I don't know if we'll get to it this year. I mean, I officially give the class to the end of April, so we'll see. I'm going century by century, so we'll see. But Shalom said he'd be happy to be the guest lecturer then.
That's great.
Tell him. All right. Again,
All right,
be well.
take
Stay
care.
safe, everyone.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
My
Thank you
pleasure.
very much.